Right, class, welcome back. We're going to start into section 7.7, which is the last section on our radicals test. We're going to talk about complex numbers. A lot of students really have issues just with the idea of complex numbers because complex numbers are also called imaginary numbers. So a lot of people are like, whoa, this is just like a really bad dream. But it's not. It's math, and it's not just a theory either. It's not mathematical theory. They actually have a lot of applications in engineering and such as like analyzing signals. So even though this seems kind of weird, still a concept that is worth understanding. So a couple rules or things you want to know about a complex number. So how do we get a complex number? Well, I squared is the same thing as -1. Again, these are just some properties that you want to memorize, which means that the square root of I is equal to the, just I, not I squared, is equal to the square root of -1. So again, this topic that we're covering for complex numbers, there's several objectives we're going to go through, and this objective is writing square roots of negative numbers in the form of BI. Well, what does this mean? Well, if I have a square root of a negative number, previously we said, hey, if you have the square root of, I don't know, -100, we just say, remember how we did this? Not a real number. Well, that's because it's a complex number. It is, complex numbers are numbers that are written in the form of A plus BI, where A and B are real numbers. Okay, so if you're like, okay, don't get any of that stuff, let's just kind of walk through a few things. So again, we used to say this is not a real number, but now we're going to say, well, we could separate this out. We could factor this out to the square root of 100 times the square root of -1. Just by factoring the -1 out of the 100. And then we know here from this property that the square root of -1 is just equal to I. So, and the square root of 10, or 100 is equal to 10. So I would say the square root, this is 10, and this is I. But we would write it in this format. I square root of A, which in this case is we're going to write this as 10I because there's not a square root left. So because we could take the square root of 100, then we would leave it in this format. But say like I wanted to do the square root of -3. Well, instead of saying, hey, this isn't a real number, which we already know, we're going to change this to the square root of 3 times the square root of -1. Square root of 3 can't be simplified, so it's going to stay the square root of 3, but the square root of -1 is I. And again, instead of writing this like when I have a whole number here, like a real number, I'm going to write 10I, but because this is still under the square root, because I can't simplify the square root of 3 anymore, then I'm going to write this as I square root 3. Okay, so these are the two ways that you'll see this. Let's do a couple more problems. For instance, if we had the negative square root of -24, how would we break this down? Well, we would say that the square root, this would simplify. So we still have this negative floating around out there. We have the square root of -1 and times the square root of 24. Well, what can be simplified here? I can factor 24 to 4 and 6. Okay, so we've got this negative here. I take the square root of -1, which is I, and the square root of 4. Again, I could rewrite the square root of 24 as the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. The square root of 4 is just 2, and the square root of 6 is just going to stay the square root of 6. But I'm going to rearrange this to be -2I square root 6. Okay, so this is just how I would write a square root of a negative number in the form of BI.